Hello, and welcome to Conquering Finale. My name is Jason Lafredo, and today we are once again getting the hang of HyperScribe. This will be part 2 of the advanced options in HyperScribe. And in the last video, we did talk about all the beat source options. We did talk about record mode a few videos earlier. So let's take a look at HyperScribe options. And in this dialog box, we did talk about tie across bar lines in the first video. So just remember that that's what's allowing Finale to transcribe ties across the bar line. Refresh screen and show HyperScribe dialog box. These two silly options I'll show you real quick. If we uncheck refresh screen, what's going to happen is unfortunately we don't get a frame there, and we don't get any feedback, visual feedback to our performance, which is kind of annoying. I mean, you'll see that it will still work, but it's weird not seeing anything happen. So, not sure why you'd want to uncheck that. Show HyperScribe dialog. If you do check that, what you'll see when you start a HyperScribe session is this dialog box appear that will give you feedback about the duration of the click, 1024 being a quarter note, and the duration of the smallest note value, 256 being a 16th note. So that would just be a reminder of how you have things set up. All right, I can uncheck that. Receive on. Now this is going to be the MIDI channel that HyperScribe is receiving information from. With only channel 1 chosen, that's probably all you need, because if you have a keyboard set up, it's just going to send on channel 1. You can change that to anything you want if you need to. And the interesting thing about selecting all channels is that if you actually have two keyboards, one set to channel 1 and one set to channel 2, and you have all channels selected, when you start a HyperScribe session, if you play on both keyboards, all the information will get filtered into that one staff, right? Which is an interesting, I'm not sure why you'd want to do that, but that's exactly what happens. I think this was probably built more for the purpose of outside sequencers syncing in with Finale. If you have different tracks with different MIDI channels and they need to go into the same staff, if you choose the all channels, it will do just that. It will put all that information into one staff if you need to. All right. It is slightly different than the option available in multi-track record that I showed you a couple of videos later, because with multi-track record, you can send information on multiple MIDI channels, and they will be sent to different staffs, essentially. With the other option, all channels receive on, again, it's just putting it all into the same staff. So that's the difference between that. All right. And then let's talk about the oddly named Quant Settings button, which pulls up the quantization settings. And we've talked about this dialog box a lot. But one thing I do want to mention is that that dialog box does also appear, or you can access it as well from the MIDI audio menu. And it's the last option here, the quantization settings. And this is the exact same dialog box. And it serves the same function. And the reason for this is because the quantization settings have more implications just other than HyperScribe. In fact, if you have music in your score and you select it, and let's say it got screwed up for some reason, in the MIDI audio menu, there's a retranscribe function here. And the retranscribe will take on the quantization settings that are set in this dialog box, right? So if you have 16th notes, when you retranscribe, it won't allow anything smaller than the 16th note. Same with the triplet rhythms and all that other stuff, all right? So just be aware that that exists in the MIDI audio menu as well. And incidentally, the click and count off menu also exists from here. And this pulls up the click and count off that I showed you in a few videos before. And I believe the reason for this is because you can actually use the click while playing as well. And so it's not necessarily exclusive to HyperScribe, that particular function. All right. So that's what that is. Let's go back here. Go to the Quant Settings. Now, I talked a lot about the smallest note value and the triplet options in some of the previous videos, but one thing I want to mention is that the EDU value. So now we know the EDU value will change when you select different rhythms, right? Theoretically, you can actually change this number to anything you want. And in fact, 341 would be the equivalent of a eighth note triplet, or actually close. I think it's 341 and a third or something. And the interesting thing is that if you set this to 341, I'm not going to demonstrate this because I already experimented with it and it's just weird. If you set it to 341 and you play triplets, you'll get triplets. If you play 16th notes, you'll get 16th notes, which is weird because it shouldn't be allowed because 341 is higher than 256 and this should be the smallest note value, right? But for whatever reason, it's not. It sort of rounds down to the nearest, actual non-tuplet value, in this case, the 16th note. And the other interesting thing is with 341 entered here, you still have to have one of these second two options allowing the triplets. Otherwise, if you have 341 here with no tuplets and try to play tuplets, you're going to get some really bizarre results. All this to say is that don't worry about the EDU box. Just select the smallest note value from the rhythms here. All right. And then let's look at more settings. Now from here we get a new dialog box that will give us some more settings for quantization. And the top section of this has to do with very short notes. Now this is like, if you're playing flams or grace notes, right? It's telling you what it's going to do. And basically it's going to remove notes that are smaller than 20 EDUs. And that's pretty fast, something like that. That first note is about less than 20. And what it's going to do is then it's going to do one of these three options. Convert it to a real note, allow grace notes, or remove grace notes. Let me just show you the difference between them, all right? So I'm going to choose convert to real notes for now, which is how it's set normally. And I'm going to play something here. And you'll see that it's basically putting the flammed or the grace note together with the main note because it thinks that I just played it wrong. It just thinks that I meant to play those together, right? So if we go in here, we'll change this back, more settings. Let's go to allow grace notes this time, and you'll see what happens. I'm going to try and play the same exact thing. Well, I screwed up the third beat there, but you get the idea. You do get the grace notes now, right? And I'm going to try the third option there, which is actually the second option. Remove grace notes. And I'll try this one more time, hopefully cleanly. And you'll see that it did not remove them. I think that's probably because I didn't play them quick enough. Let me try one more time. Yeah. 20 EDUs is really small, by the way. If you really want the grace notes, you might want to raise that number a little bit to 30 or 40. But you'll see what happens that it actually removed those grace notes. Now, what you need to know about this is with these first two options, with converting to real notes or converting to grace notes, the underlying MIDI data will remain. So even with this first option, you'll actually hear those grace notes if I play it back. Right? Same thing here, obviously. Oops. But this time, no grace notes. So when you do choose that option, which is called remove grace notes, you actually are removing the underlying data for that grace note as well. All right, that's the difference between this one versus the other two. All right, so that's what the very short notes do. Let me just go here and remove all this stuff for a second. Go back to HyperScribe Options, Quant Settings, More Settings. So let's look at the rest section here, and this minimize number of rests. Now this is a fairly accurate description of what Finale is going to do. And with this checked, I'm going to try and record some of these rhythms so that you can see that we'll actually do just that. Let's see if I can do this. Now I played those first notes fairly short, and it still gave me an eighth note, a full eighth note, right? However, if we go back to there, so many menus, and uncheck that, I should be able to get that 16th rest in the middle. Let's see if I can do it. Yep. In fact, I got some 16th rests where I really wanted the quarter notes too, right? So you do have to be kind of careful with that option because you'll get some stuff. But that's what that would do. Let's go back to there. HyperScribe Options, Quant Settings, more settings. Recheck that. Allow dotted rests in simple meter. For the love of everything good engraving, please don't ever check this, because we don't ever want dotted rests in simple meter. But if you do have it checked, you will get exactly that. Sigh. That's just bad engraving. All right. And go back here, more settings, so many dialog boxes. Please leave that unchecked. Allow dotted rest in compound meters. Now, obviously, we do want to leave this one checked, which will allow a dotted quarter rest in 6/8. All right. And below the rest section, we have options, some other options here. We have retain key velocities and retain note durations. Now, what these two options are doing is it's allowing the performance data underneath the transcription to remain. So all those velocity and duration sort of nuances that you're playing, with this checked, it will allow those to remain. If you uncheck those, it's basically going to wipe those out. So whatever gets transcribed, that's what's going to get played back as if you had, input it in speedy entry or note entry. It's going to be very rhythmic or very computer-esque, robotic in its playback without these checked. All right. Include voice 2. We did talk about in a previous video, so I'll skip over that. And let's talk about soften syncopations. All right, so in 4/4, I'm just going to play some syncopated rhythms here. See what we can do. All right, so you'll see what happens here. So basically, the softened syncopations is these quarter notes in the middle of the beats here, and the half notes in the middle of the measure here. If I were, let me do it in the bass clef. If I were to uncheck that option, soften, I'm going to try this an octave down here. You'll see what happens with the eighth notes. The syncopations do not get softened, right? It will still soften the half note syncopations in the second bar here, but you notice that it will turn these eighth notes or these quarter notes into two eighth note tied, if that's what you want to see. And there is a slight subtle difference between doing this in 4/4 versus doing this in cut time or 2/2. Let me just go back and turn the soften on for syncopations, and I'm going to record the same thing I did up here, but in cut time. So there will be no difference with the softened syncopations on between cut time and 4/4. But if I were to uncheck softened syncopations now and try this in the left hand, you'll see the difference between this one and this one. So with a 2 in the denominator, there's a difference in that it will soften these syncopations with the eighth notes, but it will not soften the syncopations with the half notes. All right, so that's just an interesting little variation of that option. So depending on what version of this type of material you want to see, if you want to see something like this, with the tied quarter notes in 4/4, what you may need to do is temporarily change to 2/2 or cut time record in HyperScribe and then change it back to 4.4. But you know, that's just an option that's available to you. Let's go back here. Let's turn that back on. And then finally, I'm going to talk about sensitivity level. Now, I've experimented with this and I've tried to figure out exactly what this is. The sensitivity level is essentially the same exact thing as the smallest note value in the previous window. In fact, there is no difference. If you set the sensitivity level to quarter notes, while the smallest note value is 16th note, it's not going to allow you to transcribe anything larger than a quarter note. If you have it the other way, if you have this set to 16th note and the smallest note value set to quarter note, same thing. It's only going to allow you to input a quarter note. I really have no idea why this exists. It's completely redundant to the option of the smallest note value in the previous menu. So maybe somebody at Finale can explain that to me someday. But again, it seems redundant, so no point in using it. All right, so that is the HyperScribe options. And then the final thing I'm going to mention in the options here is the very last option here, record continuous data. Now, this is checked by default, and this is what's going to allow Finale to record that underlying MIDI data that has related to continuous data. And continuous data is stuff like sustained pedals and modulation wheels, pitch bends, and stuff like that. If you leave that unchecked, it will ignore all that information. So depends on what you want to do. You may need to have that checked or unchecked. All right, so that about covers it. That's all the advanced options there are in HyperScribe. Hopefully this has been helpful and enlightening. And, you know, with all these options, you can sort of fine-tune your hyperscribing, as it were. All right, so thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next video.